So this is the last parallel session of the day. So I hope you all have some energy in the tank left. We have a wonderful group of speakers that I hope you don't. I'm also speaking, so I'm not being arrogant. I'm just. There's also wonderful speakers in this session. So we have about 15-minute blocks per presentation. So if you use your whole 15, you're going to have to get your questions and comments after. Okay. If you go under, then there will be some time for some interaction. But I know you got some instructions about that. Okay. So I think we can start the session. Not everybody that's involved in marine conservation governance, but it's some. So I'm going to be taking a very, this is bird's eye view. I like that. Except the bird is really high up in the air. And this presentation is really the first go at tying together some of these observations and discussions I've had, as well as ideas in the literature, including my own pieces. It continues from a presentation on transdisciplinarity that Dr. Jim Pegdy and I put together for the Maury conference, as well as involves a little bit of reflections from my PhD work. Come on in, which involved interviews with folks from DFO across the 3 regions. It brings in some perspectives from some of my work in some key international and domestic research networks, as well as interactions with awesome people in the DFO Maritimes, as well as DFO Newfoundland and Labrador region. And finally, I'm going to be reflecting on some interesting chats I had with some people involved in all those things. I won't mention who they are so that they can feel the attribution of these ideas land and they can blame me if they don't. So I'm working to better understand the limited appreciation and incorporation for social science and humanities in the governance of marine conservation. So here's what I think is the big picture. We need to advance governance for marine conservation that's a little bit more forward looking. And that involves processes that bring people together to learn about linked social ecological change, map and envision different futures, and I argue more proactively advance justice and equity. So in other words, the aim of this is anticipatory governance for just and equitable marine conservation. So we do know that governance for marine conservation, while well-intended, is perhaps not oriented so well to the future, particularly from justice and equity perspectives. There are many useful tools and approaches to anticipate things like models, simulations, scenarios, and forecasting that really have some good utility in thinking about the future in deep ways, including bringing people together. But to make good use of these tools and approaches, I think some bigger questions need to be asked about how we can foster capacity to use these tools effectively, including how knowledge is generated, communicated, and used in these processes that bring people together to think about the future of marine conservation. Future studies is about humans and environmental futures. And since the early 2000s, policy scientists, in particular Gary Brewer and Bill Asher, have identified that while prediction may be futile, anticipation is possible if and only if human-related variables are included with the great and sophisticated natural science approaches that are out there and natural scientists that have all these wonderful skills. So I'm thinking of some examples of some important variables, including worldviews and ways of knowing, human values and behavior, beliefs and perceptions, culture, history, equity, justice, power, technology, rights, rules, and norms. Social sciences and humanities are key avenues for bringing some of these variables into discussions about the future. Since social science and humanities is largely underappreciated in the whole scheme of marine conservation, and its governance is often arranged in such a way to be really busy dealing with past crises, there's a need to explore new questions. And the first one is, how do we advance social science and humanities in more holistic knowledge frameworks for governance and marine conservation into the future? So to frame the rest of my talk, I'm going to be borrowing from Dr. Marlos Cron's bridge metaphor that she discussed during a seminar in the Ocean Frontier Institute Social Science and Humanities Working Group People in the Ocean Speaker Series. Catchy title. She conceptualized effective collaboration between academia and government as a bridge, where each one represents an abutment on each side, and collaboration is the load-bearing structure in the middle. This is useful because neither government nor academia and many other people from communities can do it alone. They each have roles to play. So there needs to be capacity on each side for social science and humanities, but also we need to think about what happens on that bridge, because it's from the middle of that bridge where we get the best view of the future. So following this metaphor, I'm going to explore some quick visions and challenges and then finish with some big questions and absolutely have no answers for you. So I'm going to start with some observations about government. I don't work for DFO, nor do I speak for the organization, nor does any of this reflect what may or may not be happening in DFO. But I'm thinking about problems and opportunities in academia. This is a research and practice problem that we might be able to help with. And we know that academia alone doesn't quite get to this realistic, action-oriented type of science. So we need to talk about both abutments together if we're going to talk about the bridge. So in reading as well as listening and talking to folks from government, I'm really interested in what the vision is for government's contribution to help advance marine conservation. How the overriding goal for it could be about supporting the common interest, understanding what that is, and that by that I mean the broadest suite of needs and human values without harming the hard-won rights that people have. This is even more challenging than ever, where division is happening in many democratic institutions, but that also means it's more important than ever, and there's an opportunity to lead. Okay. So this is a really big question. We know that there are well-intentioned people in government who have got a lot on their plate. We know that problems in governance related to this regulatory obligation are really about how things are structured, not about what people are doing and what they want. And others have pointed to things like information culture, systems of resource allocation, reward systems within government, and also about how these shape the kind of foresight for a very large organization. So this is my second big question, is what could be the vision for marine conservation to help meet the broadest distribution of values, needs, and rights through decision making? What do communities want for this vision? What do other parties want? And how can we as researchers help better understand what that could be? Now I want to talk a little bit about academia. So this is the second abutment, where universities and funders actually have strong articulations of their goals. We heard a little bit about that this morning. If you read strategic plans, They have all sorts of visions and values. But we know, including for someone that just walked in the room, as well as people like Rich Wallace, Toddy Steelman, and Susan Clark, policy scientists that I work with, that there is a discrepancy between the goals that universities have and what their contribution actually is. And this shows up in things like hiring, promotion, and tenure, as well as reward mechanisms. And so we need to better understand this problem, this discrepancy, not just for people who look like me, but also for people who have different lived experiences, race, gender, class, many others, who bear more of the disadvantage of the system, who want to do things in a different way. And of course, there's a functional aspect to this problem, which is about limiting the space for social science and humanities that involves things like stories and experiences and really useful things, thank you, really useful things that can help us understand change better, understand the experiences of justice and equity, and ultimately inform collaboration for the future. So big question number 3. How can we ensure academia is fostering the broadest distribution of integrated problem-solving skills in the things that they can control? How can we open up norms and reward systems so that those kinds of problem solvers have the skills and supports they need to be effective citizens and leaders in marine conservation in whatever sector they decide to go to? So I'm going to leave a little bit now talking about the load-bearing structure. This is observations about bridging, about moving across between government and academia to work together. And of course, this is something very pie in the sky. This is about trying to articulate some goals for marine conservation. So I think we need productive, collaborative, and useful processes that bring government and academia together to integrate knowledge with action for marine conservation. The problem is that we heard already from today that it takes time and resources to even get talking to one another effectively. We each have different backgrounds, training, and live in different realities, different meanings for what's productive and useful, different goals for collaboration, different ways about talking about problems and solutions, and also different incentives to succeed, although this is changing a little bit. And this is all situated in different mandates, cultures, rules that shape who's considered successful, and ultimately, I think, reinforce the difference and harm collaboration. So this is not just about finding the right terms to talk to one another. It's deeper than that. It's finding the right space and capacity to understand each other better, to build systems that cost money, to interact regularly, funding those so that it keeps more people engaged. It's also an opportunity for research where we understand a little bit about how we make decisions, including how the government actually makes decisions. So when we produce our research, we can keep that in mind. And also how the university operates so that we can build some funding together. So this leads me to my final big question, which is how can we learn to interact with one another, sustain these interactions to advance goals of justice and equity for the future, and based in these diverse science and knowledge approaches, we can help learn, anticipate, and come up with some alternatives. Because I think that in the effort of getting conservation right, while I talked a lot about these differences, there are some common interests in terms of wanting to have effective marine conservation for the public. We both have obligations. They might be different, but we do have obligations to them, as well as there's a roster of well-meaning and intelligent people between which and among which we can collaborate. So thank you so much for listening.
We have a minute for questions. Any questions? Oh, that was a talk that was to inspire questions. What do you mean then?
That's impossible. Why is it still a problem? I mean, I could not have agreed more with most of what you've said.
Yeah.
But this isn't the first time I think I've heard some of these sentiments. And so
Yeah.
like I haven't been around long enough for it to even be that old. So
Yeah.
I know that this is a challenge we've been dealing with for so long. And to ask you the impossible in 30 seconds, why is it still a problem?
Well, I don't think it's completely as much of a problem there are some bright spots, I think, some really good examples. And I think, I think of what, Rob's not here, but Rob Stevenson, CFRN, the Canadian Fisheries Research Network, is a university government partnership that was quite successful, and it's led to stuff happening in government, but also a lot of great thinking in academia too. There's models where those kinds of things happen, but we focus a little bit on those too. But I think there's an opportunity to build more of those systems. But I'm not sure everybody gets it. So we're talking to people that agree. We need to talk about people that don't think that way to really understand what's the problem. Because not everybody wants to, by the way, we're not useful.
Or vice versa.
Vice versa. Thank you for that. I don't speak again. I don't know. Thank you for that question. Let's write about it. Gerald writes about it quite well, especially in the context of academia, the hypocrisy that we have talking about being community engaged, but not keeping these people around or giving them space to do it.
I think we'll have to move on.
Yeah, thank you.
And you don't have any one online for any questions, so I think there's.
Excellent. Well, there wasn't any time. Sorry, Zoom. Thanks for listening. Okay.
So do we have slides?
Yes. Yeah, I just didn't create any. So she has your slides ready for
me, I didn't get anything for you.
Do you have some slides?
I do.
Yeah. So why not?
Do you have it on the pen drive?
I sent it this morning.
You sent them to the Congress email?
Yes, I did.
I'm sure they're there.
Thanks for the plug, Evan.
I didn't have time to explain why everybody's in Iceland.
It's fine.
You know, it's funny, I sent this to a colleague at Livelihoods, and she's like, water is in Iceland. But with apologies.
Right. Yeah. Well, I have to apologize to Iceland
Yeah, there's no emails.
for having us.
I don't have any email from
Okay.
Okay, then we can
No,
move on to.
no, she's working on this right now. Let me just check with her, okay, Isaac?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can find it. I have it here.
I think we're gonna get.
Yeah, Isaac, she's just gonna bring it right now. Yeah, we're good. Thank you so much.
Oh, quick.
So this is the break when you think about your reception, how you're gonna make good use of networking / half years, whatever you need to do to get through it.
You can skip and go to the next
Okay.
one.
I'm doing
Yes.
All right.
This is what our city.
Grace,
Yeah.
Isaac,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
where are you based?
So,
Oh, okay. Kind of transitioning from
All
one
right.
area to the.
so we're gonna come back, but first we're gonna hear from Kayla HAMELIN on community-based approaches to addressing information gaps for forage fish in Atlantic Canada from Dalhousie. Kayla HAMELIN.
Okay, are you okay with me changing your slides for you, or? Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, cool, we're gonna do it that way.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. Again, I'm Kayla, I'm a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University. I work with Dr. Megan Bailey, and today I'll be zooming the bird all the way in on a very specific case study, rather than these big picture ideas we've been talking about, to operationalize some of this in a specific example. So I'll be talking about some of the human dimensions of recreational fishing for Atlantic mackerel, specifically within Nova Scotia, which falls within the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Lenape people. So I think we're all on the same page here that when we're talking about sustainability of our fisheries or conservation, we're not just talking about ecological aspects, but we also need to consider the economic, social, and institutional dimensions as well. So I'm really interested in how we can assess fisheries in ways that better represent the entire complexity of the social ecological system. And so a great example of a fish that is embedded in a really complex socioeconomic seascape is the Atlantic mackerel fishery. So known as amalamak in the Mi'kmaq language, or scombris scombris. These are really, in my opinion, gorgeous and adorable small pelagic forage fish from the family Scombridae. So you may be more familiar with some of their big tuna cousins. But these little guys represent a critical link in the food web of the North Atlantic because they feed on little fish and invertebrates at the bottom of the food web and are linking up to some of our top predators, larger fish, marine mammals, seabirds, and of course people. But despite their importance, they are unfortunately in the critical zone according to the DFO framework. This means that their population, as a result of overfishing and potential predation and climate effects, are now below the limit reference point, which triggers a need to take some conservation or rebuilding action. And so over the years, we've seen increasing restrictions on mackerel fishing and decreasing quotas. And this has been complicated by the fact that there are a lot of different people who want to fish mackerel with different motivations and needs. So first of all, we have a food, social, and ceremonial fishery for mackerel. So these are Indigenous communities fishing for mackerel who have Aboriginal rights and title to access the fish. We've also had commercial fisheries. So these are folks who are fishing mackerel to sell and export. We also have a bait fishery within the commercial sector. So some people have a bait license that allows them to fish for mackerel to use as bait to catch more lucrative commercial species. So you may have a lobster license, but then have a bait license to bait your traps with mackerel. And then we also have a really large group of people all around Atlantic Canada fishing for their own sport and personal use, which represents the recreational fishery. So I became really interested in the recreational fishery, partly because I've lived in Nova Scotia for a long time, and it's part of my own community of marine recreational users. And like many of the small scale fisheries we've talked about today, this fishery is poorly defined, diverse in scope, and not well represented in research, assessments, or stakeholder engagement practices. So I really wanted to set out to map out what's going on in this underappreciated aspect of the mackerel fishery. So I set out to answer some key questions that I'll try to answer for you today about who fishes for mackerel, what they do when they fish, why they fish, and how we should conserve or manage the stock from the point of view of this aspect of the fishery. And I focused in, as I mentioned, specifically on Nova Scotia, just to create some scope for the project. And for those of you who are familiar with mackerel in other parts of the world or even in other parts of the Atlantic, the fish that they would be targeting are the ones in the Northwest Atlantic population, and specifically the northern contingent that spawns within Canadian waters, as opposed to the southern contingent that is up against the American coast. So I set out to speak to adults who fish for mackerel for recreational purposes all around the province using a voluntary questionnaire. It asks questions about demographics as well as people's fishing experiences and values or benefits of their fishing practice. And I promoted the survey both online to get as much reach as possible, as well as in person through targeted dockside visits to try to reach people who might not otherwise stumble across the survey. And I used a mixed methods approach combining quantitative and qualitative analyses because I had some open-ended questions that needed to be qualitatively coded to pull out key themes, but I also was able to use some summary statistics and Bayesian modeling practices to dive into some of the quantitative aspects as well. So first of all, who fishes? Well, we have 285 people respond to our questionnaire, and it was a mix of urban, suburban, and rural fishers. So we had 52% of people coming from Halifax Regional Municipality, which is a city of about 400,000 people, the biggest metropolitan area in the East Coast. And 48% came from other counties. So this approximately represents the population distribution in the province. And I want to highlight this today because we've been talking a lot about small scale fisheries as if they occur very far from where most people live. And I think this is a really interesting example of a fishery that's embedded within urban, suburban, and rural areas. Most anglers start to fish at a young age, and more than half have been fishing for more than 20 years by the time I spoke to them. So like we're seeing in many other types of fisheries, these are folks who are being taught as children and taking that intergenerational practice with them throughout their lives. It is a very male-dominated space, again, like we're seeing in other fisheries with 82% identifying as men. However, it is a slightly younger demographic. Most people are in their working years, so in 30 to 60 years was kind of the key demographic for us. And there were, it was quite a diverse group of people as well, with 6% identifying as Indigenous. So we are seeing some folks who fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes identifying within the sport fishing community. We also have very high rates of newcomer participation. So 11% identified as coming to Canada as an immigrant or refugee. That's double the general population of the province. So we're seeing people bringing traditions from other places. And we also had high rates of Francophone participation. So there is that evidence of cultural significance to the Acadian community in the region as well. In terms of what they're doing out there, their preferred time to fish is between June and September, and that's a truncated period of time relative to when mackerel are actually around. So this represents fisher preference as opposed to fish distribution. People are fishing in multiple different ways. You can access mackerel from lots of different places. 47% are fishing from some sort of wharf or dock and relying on coastal infrastructure, whereas some have their own ways of getting to mackerel via a boat or just finding a spot on a beach or shoreline. Most people are fishing fairly regularly, going out a couple of times a week or at least a couple times a month during the peak fishing season. And these rates are similar to what they would do even if the pandemic wasn't happening. So I feel pretty confident that even though I was talking to folks last summer, this is probably representative. In terms of why people fish, I'll go through this in a great detail. So I am plotting here both the qualitative results of some of these open-ended questions where I asked folks why they fish. So we can see the top 8 themes that emerged down the y-axis. So these were food, accessibility, sport, outdoors, social connection, tradition, relaxation, and bait. And across the x-axis, we're seeing the results of a Bayesian model that predicts the probability of a fisher, an angler fishing for a particular reason. So if we follow the little black lines down, you can see, for example, food was the highest at 0.44, 44% probability that a fisher fishes for that particular reason. So the top 3 reasons that emerged were food, sport, and bait. So like we're seeing in the discussion about the cod fishery earlier, although we're calling this a recreational fishery, it is first and foremost a food fishery and people are eating what they're catching. So I'll go through the qualitative side in a little bit more detail to show what made that up. So when people are eating mackerel, usually they're motivated by the taste or the nutrition. And even if they don't eat the fish themselves, many people will bring it back to their friends, family, elders, or even pets to eat. So there may be some very spoiled cats out there. In terms of accessibility, this refers specifically to the fact that there's no license required to fish mackerel. You don't need a lot of skill, you don't need a lot of gear. And as we saw, there's many different ways you can get to coastal access points to catch a fish. So that's another reason why people wanted to fish for mackerel. And then onto sport is basically the recreation part of recreational fishing. So these are people who said that they fish because it's fun, because it's satisfying to get a fish on a line. And that was somewhat overlapping with the outdoors theme. These are folks who fish because they like to get out in nature and it's a way of feeling connected with the natural world or enjoy being out on the water. Social connection was another key one. So this was these would be people who fish in order to bond with their friends and family. They also sometimes meet people at the work that they become socially connected to, and especially people would want to fish with their children. So again, with this intergenerational aspect, people not only inherited this tradition as a kid, but want to pass it on. And that ties into the next theme, tradition, where people will specifically say they fish because they've always fished. They do it every summer. It's something that they want to continue to do in that way. Relaxation related to mental health benefits. So these are people who either specifically cited a mental illness that they get relief from. For example, they might say, I have depression, but I feel better when I'm out fishing, or they relax at the end of a long week, or it's a way to unwind, that type of thing. And finally, bait usage was an interesting one that came up. We talk a lot about mackerel as a bait fish in the commercial sector, but what I did not realize, and I'm not sure if other people realize, is it's also used as a bait in other recreational fisheries. So most people who selected, who said something that fell under this theme are using it to catch something like striped bass. So little recreational fish feed into bigger recreational fish, and there's that whole cycle too. So when we talk about alternative baits to relieve pressure on forage fish, this is something that has to be part of that discussion as well. So finally, it looks like folks are seeing what we're seeing in the stock assessment for mackerel, which is that their catches are down over time, as well as smaller fish are being caught now than in the past. But there are different opinions about what we should do about that. So I never asked specifically about different management options, but in giving people open-ended comment of options in the questionnaire, there were many opinions shared. And so I kind of grouped these into 3 key groups. One group that supports restrictions in place on recreational fishing, a group that's against the restrictions, and a group that has a specific change proposed. And so the current regulations limit the number of fish you can keep to 20 fish per person, limit the number of lines and hooks you can use, limit the size of fish you can retain, and limit there's a winter closure as well. And so folks who support the restrictions like the fact that these rules are in place because they feel they have a responsibility to do their part to protect the stock from future declines. The folks who were against these restrictions or restrictions in general found it that they likely were useless because they feel like their impact is so small, especially compared to the commercial sector. And this maybe ties into the theme of accessibility earlier too, that it's easy to, you don't need a license, you can just get out there. And finally, proposed changes. People who suggested that there was something wrong with the restrictions almost always suggested the same change. And it was an issue with the minimum size for retention. So it's generally believed in this community of anglers that the little fish that are thrown back, undersized discards, may not survive very well. And so if we're having a bag limit of 20 fish, but you're throwing back all the little ones that didn't meet the retention limit, you're actually having a way bigger impact on the stock than we know. And so there were some suggestions that maybe we should do away with that limit or change it, maybe improve the handling procedures or change gear types, but that was something that's like a really clear takeaway that could be something that could be investigated further. So we have a sense of what's going on out there in terms of the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So we have anglers from diverse communities, different types of backgrounds, all participating together in this fishery. We have people primarily obtaining food, but also being motivated by other social and cultural factors. And we see a clear desire to share their opinions about management and get involved in participating. But wait, there's more. So that's kind of, everything was nicely wrapping up. And then a big change was made this spring, which is that the commercial and bait fisheries for Atlantic mackerel were shut. So as I mentioned, quotas have been going down over the years, but this was a pretty big change. I think, as you can see, there were strong opinions coming out after this happened. So this now changes the context in which my research is happening. So now we only have recreational anglers and FSC fishers interacting with this species. But we used to rely on the commercial sector to give us fishery dependent data. So we had some indicators as to what's happening in this fishery population, this fish population. So now maybe these recreational anglers could be a source of fishery dependent data if we could establish stronger links with this community. In general, these folks, as well as the FSC fishers who are also very under-engaged in the stakeholder process, have increased importance for their experiential knowledge. And so we need to maybe be paying closer attention to this group. It's also really highlighting the importance of being aware of the fishery benefits that people get and some of the outcomes that people hope to have from the fishery. There's been a lot of focus on what has been lost when the commercial sector is shut down. We've been talking a lot today about how to protect the small scale fisheries as opposed to the big fishers, but we're actually seeing a case where the big economic benefits from the fishery have been closed down, and we're preserving some of these smaller scale local usage. So it could be an interesting example of prioritizing benefits differently. And I think we need to be aware of how some of these remaining anglers are benefiting from the stock, so we can make sure we move forward with rebuilding plans that do conservation without social harms. So I'll leave you there for today, but I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported this project, especially the hundreds of anglers that I spoke with over the past couple of years working through this project. As well as you for your attention and interest today, sticking it out till the very end. And if you want to get in touch, you can email me, follow me on Twitter, or you can check out fieldwork highlights from last summer at our project page at Go Fish MS.
Thank you so much. I think you went over it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Just let you finish.
Let's see, so Poppy, I emailed that again.
Yeah, I got it. So yeah, I have to just transfer it to the machine here. And you're gonna reach the same. Yeah, we got that.
It's okay.
Yeah. How would you like to present? Do you want to sit here and do the slide yourself, or do you want me to change it for you?
I'll press that.
Yeah.
I love those.
Oh, yeah, no, I have to transfer them over. This is the machine that's hooked up to the system, and the slides are on here. So, yeah, it's not the
There's no. Husband.
Okay. All right, everybody. Next we have Alida BUNDY from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who's going to talk about towards ecosystem-based management, the Maritimes Region EVM initiative.
All right, so I'll begin my slides. Come on, my slides here. Yeah, it's fine,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, so I first of all want to acknowledge my co-authors, who are Max Westhead, who's with Aquatic Ecosystems at DFO, Sondra Eager, who's a social scientist, interdisciplinary social scientist working with us, and Robert Stevenson, who Evan mentioned earlier, who's also a DFO scientist, he's here, and members of the Maritimes EVM initiative. So Evan talked earlier about this need for this bridging between, academics and government. So didn't call it that at the time, but that's what we're trying to do. And we're doing this through the development of what we're calling an ecosystem-based management framework. And I do actually need my next slide. Well, no, I can do the next one. It's okay, I can do the next one. So before I start talking about the framework that we're developing, I thought it'd be useful to make sure we all understand what we mean by ecosystem-based management. There's lots of definitions out there. People use terms interchangeably. So I'm going to give you 3 definitions. The first is from Rachel Long and Talbot, a nice review paper we did in Marine Policy in 2015. And if you're not familiar with the field, this is a really nice paper that summarizes a lot of the thinking. So ecosystem-based management is an interdisciplinary approach that balances ecological, social, and governance principles at appropriate temporal and spatial scales in a distinct geographical area. It recognizes complex socio-political systems, we talked about that, remember? The stakeholders involved in an integrated and adaptive management process, which reflects societal choice. So that's one. Another one from a European group, EORA, which is the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, is an integrated adaptive management approach to help marine managers consider trade-offs to protect and sustain diverse and productive ecosystems. Informed by science, it incorporates the entire system, including humans, into management decisions. So we've got this coupling of human and natural systems is a key part. And then the third one, it's a really simple one, which I like best, is balancing human activities and environmental stewardship in multiple use context. And I think that's really what we've been talking about through much of today and the 2 talks we've heard already today. Oh, super. So next one, please. We'll do a few clicks. Yeah, just click through to one more. Yeah, so that's those definitions. And so if we move to the next slide, please. There's a lot of terminology around too. And so what we traditionally do in fisheries and oceans is single species stock assessment. You're all familiar with that. And we have a fisheries management plan for single species. The next level, I'm clicking, the next level up is,
I'll take that as the cue.
yeah, is what we call an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So this is still single species, but it's introducing the idea that fisheries populations, stock species, are affected by things going on around them in the environment, by climate, by temperature, by predation, by their prey field, by their habitat. So that affects their productivity. And so that's, if you like, the first level of an ecosystem approach, where you're bringing in the broader ecosystem. And in DFO, we have a national working group working on this. The next level up is ecosystem-based fisheries management. And this is where we go beyond ecology and move across species, move across fisheries, and even doing some of the social dimensions. So that's ecosystem-based fisheries management. When we say EBM, ecosystem-based management, it's essentially the same as integrated management and ecosystem approach to management. We would even call it very similar to spatial planning. These terms are co-evolving to be broad and involve social sciences, this social system, cultural system, governance, etc. And so essentially EBM is EBFM applied to multiple activities. So you're looking at, so the difference between EBM and EBFM is EBFM should be focused on fisheries only, whereas EBM includes all activities in the oceans. It's multiple use. So when I say EBM, that's how I'm using it in that broadest term. Okay, sorry, next slide, yes. So we've talked about socio-ecological systems. Next slide, please. And so let's just emphasize what we mean by socio-ecological systems. So as I say, we're used to focusing on the environments, but yeah, just sort of flip through what we get. We've also got activities on the ocean, we've got the governance, and then we've got societal interactions, benefits, etc. with governance. This is what we mean by the linked socio-ecological system. You can't look at one aspect and without thinking about how the rest is used. And so this is the reason why we need ecosystem-based management, because you need to think about the system. So this is the business case, or what we call the business case for developing this framework. It enables you to provide integrated advice for decision making. It provides a comprehensive suite of objectives, which, as you'll see, are based on DFO and national Canadian policies as well as international agreements. It provides a common unifying framework for use across DFO's branches, so various fisheries management, aquatic ecosystems, etc. Potentially for ecosystem-based management, marine spatial planning, the blue economy, marine protected areas. This is our vision for the framework. It provides a list of objectives that can be used as a basis for evaluation of trade-offs. Some people don't like the term trade-offs, let's call them win-win scenarios, use different terminology, and to address cumulative impacts. So basically, it's a broad-based, holistic decision-making tool. That's the intent of scientists. So what does that actually mean? This is what it looks like. Evan, you mentioned the CFRN framework earlier. So it borrows from that, and I'll explain that a bit more later. But basically, it comprises of 4 pillars that address what are called the 4 pillars of sustainability: ecological, economic, social, cultural, and governance. And all those pillars can be influenced and formed also by Indigenous objectives, values, perspectives. So we're developing this framework in this region, and the intent is that we're going to unpack, or we are unpacking this, and I'll talk about that in a bit in a moment, in support of DFO's mandate. If you look at our Oceans Act, our Fisheries Act, our Species at Risk Act, other legislation, there's broad support for an ecosystem-based approach. You just have to dig in to see where it really is. So as I say, this will provide decision-making support across sectors by providing this broad range of objectives, and essentially provide a consistent structured framework to support transparent decision-based, evidence-informed decision-making. That's the plan. And next slide, please, Bobby. In order to do this, we've developed we have this ongoing ecosystem-based management initiative, and we've formed the ecosystem-based management working group. This is internal to DFO. We've been in existence for about 2.5 years. What these acronyms mean is So EBM we're a bit in the middle. At the top, that's marine planning and conservation. I go around clockwise, FFHPP, fish and fish habitat protection program, species at risk, science, fisheries management, policy, economics. This is just to show that it includes a broad range of sectors across DFO, which is essential if you're going to do ecosystem-based management. You just can't, and science, you just can't have scientists talk to each other. Jen in the back, fisheries management. We can't just have fisheries management people. We need everybody at the table. And so for 2.5 years, that everybody has been working together to develop this framework. And that in itself is a success. Sorry, next slide. So this has a bit of history. Back in the early 2000s, we had what we call the EAM framework, which is largely ecological. This is in 2010 to 2016, was the Canadian Fisheries Research Network, which we mentioned already. They basically started from the framework here and took it further to look at these 4 pillars of sustainability. What we've done since, in 2019, we had an internal workshop where we asked the question, okay, we've got the ZAM framework, we use it for some stuff, development of fisheries management plans, for example, this has been an appendix to some. Are we at the stage where we need to broaden this out to be more holistic? See other frameworks there, and let's look at it there. Let's look at that too. So we had a workshop in 2019, again cross-sectoral, and it was agreed at that workshop that we needed therefore to look at a more holistic framework. So we formed this EBM working group, EBM initiative. We got support from our senior management, and so for the last 2 or so years, we've been working to make this a reality. Since then, we've had 2 more workshops. At the workshop in 2019, it was clear that we didn't have enough social science expertise within GFO to develop the social and governance pillars. So we had a workshop here in 2021, where we invited a lot of external academic social science expertise as well as a few Indigenous representatives to start to inform that broader aspects of the framework. Over that next year, we had 4 task groups working on each of the pillars. And then earlier this year, we had a 3rd workshop where we brought all that back together again. It's going to become clearer in a second. So, as I said, we had 4 task groups for the last year or so working on each of the different pillars. The ecological and economics we did largely in-house, but we formed interdisciplinary collaborative task groups with external social scientific expertise. Some of them are in this room, not which Rob Stevens and I have basically kind of steered, but everyone's been contributing. It's really, it's a process that Evan says takes time, that you learn each other's languages, you got multiple opinions, and it's been a very useful exercise. So, as I say, over the last year we've been doing this. I mentioned earlier that the framework is embedded in policy. So we've done a broad review of our DFO policy, governance policy, and international agreements. So I'll just flash here. I'm not going to show this very much. We crossed that, walked that across our objectives and the different DFO sectors to see where we have good policy support for EBM. 5 minutes, okay. So you'll see that it's mixed. Some areas we have good support, other areas less so. So that's something to consider. So we use policy, DFO expertise, social science expertise, and literature to unpack these 4 pillars, and we're developing this ongoing narrative to show how these pillars and objectives are connected to our policy, etc. That's what it looks like. Don't be scared. This is just to show you that I'm passing exercise. We're obviously not going to go into this detail, but essentially, as we move from the left to the right, you get more detail. We unpack further and further. So we have our main objectives, our sub-objectives, so productivity, biodiversity, habitat, and then just at the first level of productivity, so we're talking about conservation, manage pressures on productivity, for example. And these are being unpacked further too. This is just to give you, this is a different kind of bird's eye view, just a quick snapshot. I mean, we could spend 50 minutes talking about one of these pillars, but really what I want to do is today just talk about the process. So as I say, it's intended to be a framework to support decision-making, broaden the basis of decision-making. It's not going to replace our existing decision-making considerations. That's a whole other governance issue, which we're not going into today. It's got lots of uses, and I don't think I'm going to have time for this. But essentially, we identified 5 main uses of the framework. The first is the checklist of objectives. So imagine you're developing a plan for example, species at risk, or a fisheries management plan, or a plan for a new marine protected area. Then this checklist of objectives that we've used can be used to say, okay, do we need objectives related to community well-being as part of this plan? Do we need objectives related to habitat? You know, so we can go through that list and check that we've got the right objectives in those plans. It can be used to evaluate and implement current policies and how are we doing for scenario comparison. As a report card. So we've got this plan, how are we doing against it? And then ultimately we see as the basis for integrated management, marine spatial planning, the blue economy, which we'll talk about later in this conference. I'm just going to flip through this because I don't have time to go through it. But just lastly, one of the DFO did this outreach on the blue economy. We have this what we heard report, and one of the key pieces I picked out of this is that we need to use integrated planning tools across governments and to stop working in silos. This is what this framework does. It stops us working in silos and allows us to take a more integrated management approach. Yes, so do I have time for questions?
You do 2 minutes.
Yay!
We have some questions for Alida.
And it was very brief. I ran through that. Sorry, guys. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I've got one. Thanks for that, Albert. I couldn't read it, but one of your charts looked like it showed a really nice sort of matrix of where policy
Yeah.
fits and where it doesn't. I think that's a really useful,
and actually, Jack Daly put that together.
a really useful exercise. I'd like to see that. I guess my question is, policy is one thing. We know we've got lots of policies that don't actually affect decision making. So are you in the process of an exercise that would then start to map where the risks are in, for example, regulations or something that will affect decision making?
We need how to implement this.
Yes, it's about the implementation. So
Yeah. So our next step, and so what I meant to say on that good diagram slide was, we're at the stage where we're almost at the stage where we have working list of objectives for each of the pillar, and we want to start doing test pilots. How would we actually use this? So this, and to address your question, not yet, but that's our next step to think about how to actually do it. Now, I think some parts will be more straightforward than others, and we don't have enough levers to make DFO change what it's doing per se, but by making it more transparent and visible and having the buy-in from different sectors, then we've got more like.
do you have a minute to speculate what a test case would look like? I'm assuming it would be sort of a proof point or precedent setting kind of test. What would that look like? I'm trying to-
Yeah, we've talked about a range of possibilities.
It's great, yeah.
It could be anything from thinking how it might inform the next marine protected area, for example, or designation of an AIO, or it could be, I don't want to get into touchy ground here, Bob, but we envision a lot of different roles, and we're still exploring exactly what might be. We've actually used it retrospectively to look at the draft management plans for St. Anne's Bank, and that's quite informative, but that doesn't get to the question you're asking about how do we actually implement it in decision making, and that is the next step.
All right. Thank you so much,
All right,
Alida.
thank you.
So next we will turn to Walter BEZHA and Grace Martin. We're going to be talking about the importance of human-fish relationships in Indigenous fisheries stewardship.
So Walter's not here, but it's in Northwest Territories. So he's recorded on the presentation, so we'll just be, there's about 4 clips of them. We'll just be between Walter. So my name's Grace Martin. I'm a public policy PhD candidate at Carleton University. And my supervisor is Stefan Schott. And that's located in Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And today I'll be presenting, like I said, with Walter BEZHA, who's an elder in the community of Delaney, which is a community of about 600 people on the southwestern shore of Great Bear Lake, or Satu, in Northwest Territories. And yeah, well, today will be, oh, you can just press play actually. Okay, so this will be Walter introducing himself.
And let's see. My name is Walter BEZHA. I am presently lead in what we call an elders council in Delaney as part of the Livelihoods government.
Next slide. Thanks, the short one. The subsistence fishery in Great Bear Lake is a dietary staple for the community. The community of Delaney, as I mentioned, they're also known as the Satu Otene, which means people of Great Bear Lake. There's also a recreational, a world-class recreational trout fishery on the lake, and the lake's monitored annually by Fisheries and Oceans Canada as part of their stock assessment process. So Walter and I have been working together for a couple of years with several other people on a few different overlapping projects, all essentially supporting Delaney's aspiration for food sovereignty, for achieving that in the future with fish as a potential food source, complementing other sources of country food. But the research question that we're focusing on today is focused on, as the title alluded to, relationships between humans and fish and how this can support fisheries stewardship and conservation planning. And we're looking specifically, zooming in again, on the case of Delaney and the Satu Otene. And then we'll let Walter speak.
Something that people have to remember is that Aboriginal people have, prior to contact, have always harvesting it's a part of their lives. So here, Delaney, the issue is what do we do today? How do we get our people to continue with that culture of harvesting, being out on the land? Now, the basic thing about harvesting, being on the land, hasn't changed. What is new is that the kind of projects or studies that go on, I think that many people themselves hear more and more as they learn more about, science is science, whether you have it in our culture or somebody else. And they want to be part of it. And they want their own, how they view science and how it's used in their own culture to be part of any decision making that goes on. And how do you do it? Well, you get your information to be part of the decision making, because it's such an important part of Aboriginal culture is exactly that. People make decisions on wildlife, what they eat, where they harvest, what they harvest on a daily basis, and yet people don't really recognize that. There's scientists in the world that recognize Aboriginal people here on Bear Lake, scientists that come here and I would say, whatever you're doing, I want to listen to you. I want to know what you're doing. I didn't come here for you guys to listen to me. I want to know how you keep this lake pristine. It's a fully functioning ecosystem that is still there. You can still drink the water. The fish seem to be happy, or there's lots of fish. There's hardly any diseases in the fish except for normal things that happen with populations that get too large. So this is part of this whole fishes project. You want the Aboriginal people to be part of that study. You want their information to be part of it in a way that science can understand. But at the same time, also recognize that the traditional knowledge or their science also stands on its feet. The knowledge itself has to stand on its own. It can't survive otherwise. It's got to be authentic. And those are the kind of things that the challenges we have in science.
So in our approach, we're seeking to facilitate meaningful knowledge exchange and really elevate and center Satu Otene perspectives. And at the same time, we're reflecting on the impacts of normative assumptions that are often linked with dominant scientific and legal bureaucratic systems. It's part of the knowledge coevolution framework. And we're applying a mixed methods approach, which includes both Satu Otene and Western research methods. So storytelling circles, online learning and knowledge exchange, as well as interviews, focus groups, and surveys. Yeah, so right now we're building on, there's been quite a bit of research done with fisheries and fish in Bear Lake. A lot, as I mentioned, on the scientific side by DFO, there's that long-term monitoring has been going on for 20 years. And there's a strong relationship with DFO and the community. In about 2012, 2013, DFO started a traditional knowledge study. And so we're building on that. That was really focused on fish like harvest locations and species identification, as well as some environmental trends changing over time related to climate change. We're bringing in other forms of knowledge that are less tangible. Some of them are spiritual or broader worldviews or approaches to decision making that may be different or outside of our Western or dominant way of looking at things. Right now, we're really focused on human-fish relationships, which is really the focus of this, and we'll speak more about that, as well as looking more at just subsistence harvesting and all of the knowledge around that, and food preparation, the role of women, and looking at that in the past, present, and also future goals for that. And there's also the recreational fishery, which we will look at as well, and how the community feel about that. And what's really important is the aspects of intergenerational knowledge exchange, so across families and through generations. And an important aspect is the community knowledge validation. So we're working with a community group called the Caribou and Fish Working Group, or the Ekwehe Working Group, which is comprised, it comprises knowledge holders from the community of different ages and genders that all have different expertise locally about fish, and ensures that the research that we're producing together is actually like representative of the community knowledge. And I think this will be well heard.
What would our grandfathers do or grandmothers do? I said, ask the fish. Ask the water, ask them what, wow, you know. And it's such a wonderful phrase because that's what we're doing. You want that information because there are protocols there too. Aboriginal people didn't make up a lot of these things. It comes from the environment. You know, I speak the language, I write the language very well, and when I try to find out meanings of words, it goes back to the environment. It's the environment that taught us about our language. Then it's all part of that. I listen to elders a lot over the years, and that term Denizini comes up all the time because they're talking about themselves as true human beings. It's like saying he's a good citizen. The first thing is to be part of the environment. Thanking the creator for all of its creation on earth. We share. Sharing is a huge part of harvesting. You can't have just a name of a place for the sake of having a name. No, the name goes back thousands of years and it's designed so that the rationale and the stories behind all that relates to how it's connected to the rest of the environment there. And that's a beautiful thing when you learn it, because that knowledge, as a hunter and somebody that wants to go get fish or wildlife, that relationship really helps you understand how you're going to hunt wildlife or where you're going to hunt wildlife. And again, in the Fisheries project, I think that's one of the things that's going to probably come out. You're going to say, our studies should focus more about doing this at this time of the year.
So what we found is this very strong link between subsistence fish harvesting, the food fishery, and conservation. So they go hand in hand. It's not a conservation plan and subsistence plan. Subsistence harvesting is essentially conservation planning in this culture, at least. And so we're hoping that this work will actually help inform local, regional, territorial, and federal decision-making for the lake, because there's a few different jurisdictions, and that's another issue as well. And ultimately, we hope that the work will support the community's aspiration to achieve food sovereignty with fish as a key part of that, complementing caribou. So caribou, that image before and this image as well are both from the community's caribou conservation plan that they've developed themselves. And so they're sort of a leader in conservation planning in their traditional way. It's completely based 100% on their Sato-Otene approaches. And it's currently navigating how to fit that into the current regulatory system in the Northwest Territories, which is really another issue too, which is very interesting to me as a policy PhD student. I think there's one more clip. We have time from Walter.
Wildlife in many ways, there's many things that Aboriginal people's cultures has brought forward today that we didn't know, that we didn't have any idea. And yet it's there. That knowledge is there. And I hope with projects like Fishes, we bring those things forward. We bring it forward in science so that people can understand that. Environment doesn't change because we study it in the Western world or in Aboriginal way. Fish doesn't change. Caribou doesn't change because of that. It's us as people and the way we harvest, the kind of relation we have that makes a difference. And I think that those concepts are reflected. They're shining in the way Aboriginal people relate to wildlife. And it's then to be a human being, to be a part of the environment, to follow those protocols. So I think in terms of these studies and the Fishes projects, I think that there's a whole paradigm shift in how we look at management or so-called management. Because it has to be the environment, the fish, the caribou, all those living things. Those are the ones that have to tell us how we can do things better.
Yeah, so thank you and Masi. Those are our email addresses, and we'd like to acknowledge, again, there's several co-authors. That's not even all of them, that's the working group there at the end, and all of our funding agencies as well, which is on the final slide. And thank you as well for your attention and for the opportunity.
Oh,
Oh, that's not for her, okay?
Oh, that's nice, supervisor.
But we do have a minute or two for questions for Grace, if anybody has one. Barry.
Their plan, is there any contemplation of limiting the catch using quotas? And two, is there any plan to produce anything for export from the area?
Those are great questions. Yeah, which I didn't go into that much, but so at all actually. I don't know about the quota around subsistence fishery. Definitely that's not a cultural, it doesn't seem to be something that they would culturally support. There's a quota, I believe, on the recreational fishery. And right now we haven't dug too deep into how the community feels about that, or so it may be a bit political. In terms of exporting, like commercial fisheries is a no. So this is a bit of a different system. And it may be easier in some ways because there's no commercial fisheries. There's literally one community on the lake. It's kind of an environmental gem, and the community kind of wants it to stay like that.
Yeah.
There's no road there. So it's also a little bit, it's not that applicable of a case study to like all the other lakes in Canada.
I think it shows why it is successful.
Yeah, that's kind of what Walter would say. Yeah.
All right, let's thank again Grace. Looking through these, but there is time to talk and have questions over beers when we finish our wine. We're going to go now to Tony Charles, who's beaming in digitally. Then we'll end with Poppy. I know I've seen Poppy's presentation, which is shorter. We're going to be a little over time. But again, we will wrap things up where it counts out there. Hi, Tony, great to see you.
Hello there. I'll just get my screen going here, just one moment.
Yeah. We're just teeing you up on the projector here too. There we go.
Okay, so that's ready, is it?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I've really enjoyed the talks in this session, and very impressed with, in particular, with the ones involving Indigenous communities and nations. I'm going to be talking today about a global project that I've been involved in with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, looking at small-scale fishery stewardship, thinking conservation and livelihoods. And this is still an ongoing project, and this is the first conference presentation of some recent results. This was presented in a webinar some months ago, and then in another V2V webinar a few more months ago, or less months ago. But this is the first time that we have a full bit of research to report on. So this is in collaboration with my academic colleagues, Alison McNaught and Shannon Hicks, but also with FAO colleagues and global fisher organizations. And in particular, it is in support of the International Year for Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. At the bottom of the screen there's a website that I welcome you to have a look at. It doesn't have the research results of the that I'm going to be describing some of today, but it does have the examples that we've assembled from around the world of small-scale fishery stewardship. I won't, just with limited time, go through all the details here, but again, that website gives more material on it. I do want to, though, use this opportunity to highlight the support of the particular global organizations, the WFF and WFFP membership organizations, the ICSF support organization, and the IPC Working Group on Fisheries. Lots of acronyms there, sorry about that, but it just wouldn't be right not to acknowledge these wonderful world-leading fisher organizations. So we started out our project with the idea of trying to hear the voices of fisher communities and fisher organizations around the world, and we didn't have the resources to actually go places and interview people and run through a massive project. So instead, we laid out a web-based platform that you can see a screenshot of here. We provided a translation facility into about 15 major languages, and we basically did everything we could to make it possible for fisher organizations to provide their stories for a global audience. And we were really gratified to find that we had, there's thousands of examples, but not everybody has the time and resources to contribute. But we had 46 contributions, well, 50 contributions, and some are still in the progress, but 46 that form the basis of the analysis that we have so far. So here are some of those from around the world. And if you've seen one of our previous webinars, you've seen this as well. So I won't go through this in great detail because I do, in the short time available, want to get to some actual analytical results. But here's a few things. A wonderful Indigenous contribution from Hawaii, from Africa, Europe, Comoros in the Indian Ocean, Bolivia. So just a note here that we had many marine examples, but also a good number of inland ones as well. Indonesia, octopus. And to get to the actual results of what we were looking at here, I'm going to show you a few charts. This is, so we asked everyone in a typical survey that was online or printed, depending on how they preferred to look at it. And a lot of questions. I was just really gratified by the number of responses we got to this survey that covers a whole range of topics around small-scale fishery stewardship. So looking at the motivations, what really people were in their responses, fisher organizations. So in each case, we had a submission from a particular individual that was representing a fisher organization or community. I should say in some cases we had a support organization submitting, and in that case we made sure that they were in fact representing the fisher organization or community. So you can see here the motivations. The blue bars are the first choice motivation. If you want to look at the top three choices, then you look at the total size of the bars there. This was a survey of small-scale fishers, so it's perhaps not surprising that fishery sustainability was the top noted motivation. But to me, and perhaps to everyone there and everyone hearing this now, the fact that livelihood sustainability is a very strong second in the total level of motivation, I think is not a surprise at all, and just goes to reinforce what many of us have always said, that livelihoods are a key part of stewardship and conservation. A similar question we asked was about the goal of the stewardship activity. So the specific activity that we asked people to look at, what was the actual goal that they were pursuing, as opposed to a motivation. Those two are obviously connected. But here again, we saw that secure and sustainable livelihoods was high up, but also many stewardship-related, environment-related goals, biodiversity conservation, productive fishery, of course, but healthier ecosystems is high up on the list. And then quite a few that were looking at the community well-being, the cohesiveness of the community, nutrition, food security, and social and cultural goals were also important. Not quite at the top there, but important nonetheless. We developed a typology of stewardship that came out of kind of a grounded evolution of a typology that came out of initial interactions with fisher organizations, and then was used in the survey itself, a 7-point typology, where the first 4 are what I would think of as direct stewardship activities. Physical activity refers to actual get your hands dirty kinds of mangrove restoration, habitat restoration, stream restoration, that sort of thing. Managing fisheries is engagement in fishery management, the governance aspects. Co-management would be included there as well. So it doesn't have to be done entirely by the community by itself. It can be in a co-management basis. The third, managing use of aquatic areas, including, has been discussed already in this session, ecosystem-based management. And the fourth refers to engagement of the community or the organization in something broader. So that might be, could be ecosystem-based management, could be fishery management at a larger spatial scale where the fishing community takes part in that activity. The last three in this typology are meant to be more support activities, knowledge building, capacity building, monitoring, communications, outreach, education. But of course, this is in the context of stewardship, so the communities are answering on that basis. So when we look at that, given that that basis of those 7 topic areas, we asked what were the most frequently utilized, and this is in particular in the examples that people are giving. So in this case, you can see that managing fisheries, but also knowledge and capacity building came out at the as the top 2. Some others, you may or may not think that physical activity would be higher, but it's still substantial. By the way, the fact is that they were allowed to double count, so they could list more than one item, and so in this case, some came out higher than others in frequency, but they were all widely used as mechanisms of stewardship. One, I think, very interesting aspect was asking the fisher organizations and communities what led to success. This was, of course, on the basis that there had been success. So in some cases there wasn't success, and that was informative itself. But here we were looking at if there was success, then what contributed to that. You can see here, this obviously is in order from top to bottom of frequency. So here, as has been seen in some other studies of fishery management, leadership is way up at the top. Knowledge is, and the nature of the community organization are also big ones there. Interestingly, the financial aspect, but even more so the equipment or infrastructure was not a big factor of success. So having stuff to work with, infrastructure and so on, didn't rate highly among the fisher organizations and communities. I want to get to the end here, but doing that by just recounting a few of the lessons learned that were reported. These really are, I think, inspiring and good word for word examples of what people were thinking. You can, if you can scan this, and I know there's a lot of words here, you'll see that there are 3 main themes, I think, that come out of, and this is just a sample here, but one is giving back to nature, another is people coming together, and a third has to do with knowledge and the different kinds of knowledge that come into things, into decisions. So really some impressive words of wisdom, I would say. So I want to leave it there, and hopefully there's a chance for a question or two if there are any. But again, the website in the bottom left, you're welcome to have a look at. You can see there a website also for the Community Conservation Research Network, if you'd like to have a look at that. Both of those go into and provide a lot of resources on small-scale fisheries and stewardship. So let me leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. So do you have a time for a question? Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I was just wondering, when you talk about the different ways that people saw success happening and the lessons that they pulled out of it, did you see any distinctions between cultures, or were you seeing a fisher culture kind of?
That's it. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I'd say is that we probably have more analysis we can do of that point, of looking at the geographical and cultural differences. But it varies so much. And there were other factors, I think, that came into what people offered in terms of their words of wisdom. It depended somewhat on what kind of stewardship project they were engaged in. Some were more technical kinds of projects, and some more team building or community building kinds of projects. So it varied a lot. One of the people who submitted, and you might have noticed these were not anonymous. So unlike some surveys, this wasn't an anonymous one, and our research ethics process was telling people that they would be that their material would be used and publicized. And sorry, this is a little off topic, but I just want to say that that one of the biggest benefits, and one thing that I think we're most gratified about is that the actual publicity that this project is giving to some of these people and projects is something that they really are enjoying and making use of. And we basically created a website for each example, and they can use that website to publicize and support their work. So so back to the point, and sorry for the long-windedness there. I think that there are differences. One of the submitters, Kevin Chang, is a very established individual in Hawaii who is very involved with IUCN and other conservation organizations, and has his words of wisdom are really profound, I'd say. And he was part of a project that led to community-based management that was actually effective in Hawaii. So it varies a lot, but I think culture is a big part of it.
Awesome. Thank you. Tony.
Thank you.
So would you be willing to stay for one more presentation? Is that going to be okay?
It will be what do they call them? Rapid quickfire presentations.
That's
So
what-
it's going to be an invitation and an introduction. But
Great.
It's not a 15-minute presentation. Let's see.
And you're buying beers, right?
Yes.
We'll say.
Yeah, my budget is too big to ignore. All right. I would like to introduce the wonderful and fantastic Poppy KEOGH, who's going to be helping talk about getting conservation right, but from stepping from zero to moving together in marine conservation. You're welcome.
Yeah, as I said, I'm going to make it nice and quick. I'm going to speed through it because we're all hungry. Yes, I'm going to introduce this project that I've been working on as part of my role as a research assistant with Gratnet's group and within OFI Module I. And this project is, well, this presentation is titled Stepping from Zero, Moving Together, Exploring Values and Visions for Marine Conservation Targets. And what this presentation will talk about, slash I'm going to kind of boil it down to, is catalyzing Step Zero for marine conservation targets. It's a transdisciplinary outreach in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it's funded by the Fisheries and Oceans Canada Ocean Management Contribution Program. So basically the project seeks to build relationships that can help improve the understanding about values, visions, and experiences of ocean users, actors, and leaders for marine conservation in the context of the Canadian government's marine conservation targets. I'm going to skip straight to give a little bit of context about what the Canada's marine conservation targets are. So as many of us might have already heard about the conservation targets, which may include things like the plan to increase the conservation of Canada's oceans by to 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. These are numbers that we hear being thrown around quite a lot. It's currently at 6% protected within marine protected areas. And in reaching these targets, the government kind of hope to advance the progress on effective management, new site establishment, all of those things listed in that list there, which I'm not going to go through. But in order to meet these targets, planning for marine conservation and ocean, the ocean users requires diverse knowledge sources and collaborations and relationships among stakeholders in the public and private sectors, which will be vital to advance these conservation outcomes which they wish to reach. So, in the spirit of advancing collaboration for meeting these conservation targets, this project basically wants to use engagement, awareness raising, and capacity building within what we're calling a digital platform, which is a fancier word for a website, but it's basically meant to be a place a bit more exciting than a website, and something that is going to be a place that people can share knowledge, create a space for knowledge on marine conservation and what people know about it, what they think about it, what people want from it. And yeah, this is the first stage of this project that we've gotten to, basically, is creating this digital platform called Getting Conservation Right, which also happens to be the name of this session, so it's an important one to get to. And the goal of this platform were basically to build awareness about marine conservation, like I just said, make visible the connections between people in the ocean, share stories, community-led conservation initiatives, and to build a stronger community among ocean using actors and leaders in Newfoundland and Labrador. So one of the main things we asked people of when we built this platform was, why marine conservation? We wanted people to have a think about it, and think about what connects them to the ocean, what they consider to be marine conservation in the context of their communities, things like that. So our team also came up with multiple themes that we deemed important within marine conservation to start the conversation and to get it going. Things like the ocean as a source of inspiration for poetry, songs, you name it, the foundation of all life, which is a big concept, but basically means that we get, our oxygen and things like that from food and more. So that, like, we talk about small scale fisheries and balance in climate, health and well-being. I'm zooming through this. So just to get a bit of a glimpse as well into the platform itself. One of our sections of the platform, which I'm going to also encourage you to go and check out, since I can't do a thorough step-by-step today. But one of the parts that is a kind of the most interactive part is basically a gamified version of trying to get people to interact with these ideas and what they think about marine conservation, what they know, maybe what they don't know, through games, quizzes, and we have something called the pairs game, to try and gauge people's awareness and their interests in elements of the marine ecosystem in Newfoundland and what they deem to be an important part of it, an integral part of it. So we use pictures, pairs of pictures, 28 pairs together, and people had to pick which one they deemed more important out of the two. So it's like a pairwise comparison. And these are two of the examples of a coral versus a caitlin. So the idea is that people would take the first one that they think is more important to the marine ecosystem in Newfoundland and Labrador. And here I have some images. I don't know if I'm going to go through all this people, but here are some images we have on the website, things that have been submitted. Most of these are photos of taken by the team members from different events and different areas around Newfoundland and Labrador. But I think this just kind of shows stepping from zero, which is talking to the people who are have their livelihoods, who are connected to the ocean. And I'm losing around myself now off my speech. But so here, while there are many steps involved in reaching the marine conservation targets, which I mentioned earlier on, what we kind of gauged from the platform so far, what we gauged from the early stages, that people's close connections to and knowledge of the ocean are so important that they are at step zero. And we see this connectedness expressed in culture, arts, music, and food. And if you go and visit our platform, you'll see this in things that like recipes people have submitted, and the photos I think tell a really important story of that food, livelihood, and well-being seem to be the big themes that come out of this, and the things that we keep seeing crop up again in people's stories that they've submitted, and recipes related back to food and well-being, and then the photos as well that you've seen in this presentation and are pretty tagged with that as well. So the next step after stepping from zero, and the next step in this project is going to be the moving together. So taking everything we know from step zero and moving together into the future of marine conservation in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we've, as part of this project, towards the end of the first stage, we developed a list of future partners, which include individuals, groups, organizations, for the next stage of engagement, which we're going to use the knowledge platform. And this includes a list of public schools, Lions clubs, all around Newfoundland, Labrador, and different communities, as part of the bigger moving together communication strategy. In conducting the background research and the development of the knowledge sharing platform, the project team learned about the diverse ways that peoples can view marine conservation, including the social, economic, and cultural linkages from food, livelihoods, and communities. These themes inform monitoring and stewardship, as well as advancing capacity building in moving together. And that's the next part of the project. And then, yes, I'm finishing here on the things that we want you to go and engage with, which is our website, digital platform, our Twitter, and our email. If you have any thoughts, questions, queries, we would love to hear from you. And yes, thank you for that. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Not around. Let me ask a question for Poppy here before we head out into the hallway. Everybody ready to step from zero? Okay, so if something comes up, she's wearing the blue shirt. Thank you so, thank you so much for a wonderful session after a very fantastic day. I wish you a wonderful night, and we'll see you tomorrow if we don't see you out there.